Now, lucky last for the afternoon, may I introduce to you Yvonne Singer. She is the Burn Program Coordinator at the Victorian Adult Burn Service in Melbourne, Australia, here. She's worked in burn care for over 20 years, also holding various positions with national and international organisations, including the International Society of Burn Injuries and the Australian and New Zealand Burn Association. Yvonne works in burn care and prevention, registry science, quality improvement, implementation science, patient safety and human factors. She holds an affiliate position with Monash University related to the Burn Registry of Australia and New Zealand, sits on the steering committee and chairs its HCF research project team. She says, I quite like this, she says she can turn on taps, but has no idea, apart from that, about anything to do with plumbing. Welcome, Yvonne.
Thank you. So I just need to press this green button, is that right? Okay. Thank you. I'm going to start today by telling you about Nolene and Bob. Nolene and Bob are two Victorians. In September 2016, Nolene collapsed in the shower at home, and she knocked the cold tap off, and she remained under the hot water tap for about 5 minutes before Bob could come to assist her. He, at that moment, had just taken out his hearing aids and was cleaning them on the desk, so he didn't hear her screaming out till he actually popped them back in his ears. Not only did she hit the hot tap on, but she fell over the shower plug. So it created a hot water bath around her, and she sustained serious scalds to her hands, her arms, her shoulders, her back, her legs, and it covered more than 30% of her body. She initially came into the intensive care unit at the Victorian Adult Burn Service at the Alfred, and it was very touch and go. We prepared Bob for the worst. I think they're married now for about 60 years. And we were fairly sure that Nolene was going to die from her injuries, but she proved us wrong. She's a very resilient lady. And 3 years on, she's gone back home. And this is a photo of the two of them when I went to visit them last March. And their journey towards recovery didn't stop when she left the hospital. You can see her left hand there is quite contracted. One of her biggest regrets is she's unable to wear her wedding rings, and she used to make teddy bears and she can't use her hands to do that. She also can't drive anymore and she can't do the housework. And Bob describes that she sleeps a lot, and he says that every night it takes her about 2 hours to eventually get to bed because she does everything she can to avoid this getting into the shower. She won't stand up in the shower anymore, and when she does get in, she'll only use a chair. They continue, and for Bob, in the last 3 years, in March, he's told me he's only had 2 weeks off from looking after Nolene. He's been her full-time carer. They still live in the house that they raised their children in outer suburban Melbourne, and it doesn't meet the current requirements for installation of tempering or thermostatic valves, which may have made a difference for Nolene in minimising the impact of her injury. So this talk is for Nolene and Bob and for all the other Australians out there, because we are an ageing population who live under similar conditions. So I'm going to talk to you about, give you a brief overview of the Burn Registry of Australia and New Zealand. I'm going to show you some of the data related to tap water skull burn injuries in Australia and New Zealand. I'm going to quantify the personal costs and the healthcare costs of these. And I'm going to discuss the little bits that I know about hot water regulations in Australia that's managed by the Plumbers Code of Australia, and ask you whether that's enough, to protect our most vulnerable. And if it's not, what can we do and how can we, as stakeholders with differing vested interests, how we can join together to improve hot water safety in our country and beyond. I just wanted to let you know I've included some photos of burn injuries that may be confronting for some of you, and I apologise to some of you. If they are too distressing, I do encourage you to look away, but I do think it's necessary so you can try to understand the magnitude of these injuries and the impact that they have on people's lives. So the burn care in Australia and New Zealand is highly centralised. There's 17 designated burn centres across the two countries for a combined population of about 30 million people. There's 4 burn centres in New Zealand and there's 13 in Australia, and they treat nearly all cases of severe and complex burn injuries in the region. And this is very similar model of care to most first world countries in the States, Canada and across Europe as well. The Burn Registry of Australia and New Zealand, or the BRANZ, which was what I'll call it through this presentation, was established in 2009. It's a clinical quality registry that collects epidemiological, treatment and outcome data on all patients who are admitted to burn centres across the two countries for more than 24 hours, or less than 24 hours and they died, or they had surgery and were discharged home. And it's a collaboration between Monash University, Department of Epidemiology, the Australian and New Zealand Burn Association, and all 17 burn centres. And it's those three groups that I'm representing today. So we extracted data from the Burn Registry relating to all admissions from July 2009, basically from when we started the registry, to June the 30th, 2018. So that's 9 years worth of data from all 17 sites. And over that period of time, has that come up? There were 670 cases of tap water skull burn injuries, which were severe enough that required transfer and admission to a burn centre. That's approximately 75 injuries per year. And we estimate we see approximately 10% of burn injuries that occur across the country. Only the most severe come to the burn centres, so there's a lot more than the figures that I'm showing you here. This graph shows you the distribution of injuries over the 9-year period. It's got the years going across the bottom on the x-axis and the number of cases on the y-axis there. And the different colours of green represents adults and blue represents children. And note that in 2009 and 2018, those 2 years, I've only got 6 months of data each because it goes from June to June. Overall, the distribution of adults to paediatric patients was almost on par, which is a bit different to the general burn population where 70% of our patients are adults. So there's more children in this tap water skull burn injury group. This next picture could be confronting for some of you. This is Molly. She's from Adelaide. She was sitting in the bath. Her mother did the right thing. She was with her. She went out, unfortunately her mother went out to answer the phone and her brother was in the bathroom with her and he turned the hot tap on. This is a very common, when I pulled out the data, went through the data registry, this was a very common description of what happened, where there was usually perhaps another sibling in the bathroom who's fiddled with the taps, or the child themselves is fiddled with the taps. And she sustained a 15% burn injury to her upper body, and she's going to need to wear these scars for the rest of her life. This graph demonstrates the size of burn, and I've put them into groups. And you can see that the first group is 0 to 9%, and the majority of burn injuries are smaller in size. They're less than 10% body surface area. Nevertheless, they were severe or complex enough still to require admission to a burn centre. And just to show you what do I mean by 10%, when I talk to you about percentages burns, this is the Wallace Rule of 9, which we use to calculate a surface area of burn, or total body surface area. It's an indication of burn severity for us. So any burn that's bigger than 20% surface area is considered a major trauma. And so just to show you, someone's entire arm back and front is 9%, an entire leg back and front is 18%, the front of the torso is 18%, the back is 18%, and the head is 9%. So that's how we break it up, and we can calculate what the surface area burn is using those figures, and this will tell us how severe it is, whether they need to go to the burn centre, whether they will survive, and how much fluid resuscitation we need to give patients. This graph demonstrates the distribution of cases across the lifespan, with the bars representing males to female, males and female cases. You can see there's a huge peak. The most represented groups are the 1 to 2 year olds. I actually work in an adult unit. This was the Alfred the Victorian Adult Burn Service is an adult unit, and the Royal Children's manages the paediatric cases less than 16 in Victoria. And I guess the paediatric data was a surprise for me. So it's the 1 to 2 year olds and the 0 to 1 year olds that are highly represented. And the other group that are highly represented are the over 70s and over 80s. And if we think about the proportions of the populations that are over 70 or 80, they're a high risk of burn injuries, these older people. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about older people and why they're more vulnerable to succumb to a burn injury than other age groups. Overall, males accounted for 55% of injuries, Whereas in our general population in the burn registry, 70% of our patients are male. So it tells us that more females get burnt by tap water scalds than in the general population of burn injuries, which includes other types of scalds, flames, electrical burns, acid, etc. This is an elderly gentleman that suffered a skull burn injury in the shower, and you can kind of see on his shoulder there, he's got most of the heat of the water's hit him on the shoulder. That is black eschar, that's full thickness burn that needs to be excised and needs to be grafted. As the water hit his shoulder, it's dripped down his arm, the water's cooled down, and you can see how his arm is pink. It's still burnt, but it's a less of a severe burn than what we've got on his shoulder here. You or I could survive this burn injury. We'd have gone to surgery. His was a 12% burn injury, but because of his other disease, because elderly are more likely to have other disease processes, he ended up dying from this burn injury because we were unable to take him to theatre to give him an anaesthetic, because the anaesthetic they thought he'd probably fall off the perch from the anaesthetic. So this man died from sepsis, whereas if this was in a 20-year-old, they probably would have lost about 10 kilos and been discharged home in about 3 weeks with scars. So elderly people, they're overrepresented, and their outcomes after burn injury are a lot worse than other groups. This looks at the place of injury. Where did the burn injury occur? And you can see over 90% occurred in the home, and that kind of biley yellow colour is 4.5% occurred in someone else's home. And you can see only 7 cases occurred in schools and kindergartens, anywhere where children are, and 0.4%, or was it 4 cases, occurred in residential institutions that covers aged care homes. So it tells us that current regulations about controlling hot water temperatures in nursing homes and in school, where children are probably working quite well to minimise the injury in those settings. But it also shows us this huge gap of where current regulations are leaving people exposed for injury. And this is the activity, what they were doing at the time of injury. So, most of these injuries occur in the home, and over 83% of them occurred when the patient's bathing. So really targeted burn prevention messages that we can work on together in this. And this is injury intent, whether the injury was intentional or unintentional, and as you can see, 92% of these were accidents or unintentional injuries. This is another gentleman who had a fall in the shower, and you can see he sustained a really nasty burn down over his torso, over his hip, and over his lower belly. This gentleman also succumbed to his injury because, again, he was too high anaesthetic risk, and it was he ended up dying from sepsis. When a burn starts to take over more than 30 or 40% of the body surface area, the main way that we close a full thickness burn, how we get rid of that dead tissue, is we cut it off and we take skin from somewhere else and we put a skin graft over the top. But if someone's got a burn of 30 or 40%, there's limited places that we can harvest skin from. So the bigger the burn, it's going to take us longer to close the wound, and closure is a lot more complex, and we need to use bioengineered skin substitutes. I'll just talk a little bit about those as I go through this talk. And this just shows you, did the patients require surgery? And 65% of patients actually had a surgical procedure. So it tells us that these were predominantly deep burns. And this tells us that 13 or almost 14% of admissions were severe enough to actually require an intensive care admission. And this tells us about survival at hospital discharge, and 3.73% or 25 cases died. And in our general burn population, it's consistently between 1 and 1.5% is our mortality. So this group have a higher mortality than the general burn population. And again, another full thickness burn of an elderly gentleman who fell in the shower. He had a 25% surface area burn. The other thing that how I said that the torso is 18%. With people that are obese, their torso is going to be bigger than 18%. So his burn, we calculated it to be 25%, but it was possibly a lot bigger because the front of his body was certainly a lot more than 18%. Here's another gentleman who had... He had lots of other injuries that made his capacity to cope with the stress of burn injury. It reduced his capacity to cope with the stress, and he eventually succumbed. He rallied for about 6 weeks, and he eventually succumbed to his injury after 6 weeks, which is really difficult for the family to kind of go through that 6 weeks period of a slow and steady decline. And these are the characteristics of patients according to survival status. The characteristics in the left-hand column, and then the 645 survived in the second column, and the 25 cases that died. So it's hard to compare groups. It's not comparing apples with apples because the sizes of the groups are very different. It's 25 compared to 645. But you can see the ages of the patients that died were grading. You see the average age was 75 years for the patients who died and 14 years for the patients that survived. They're more likely female, and their burns were bigger. The median, 50% of the patients who died had burns that were 15% surface area compared to 5%. And you can see they also had deeper burns as well. The average deep burn was 10.5%. And this just looks at survival status by age group. And you can see that the red section, the more of the elderly people are dying than the younger ones. And this one looking at survival status by TBSA burn size. And you can see, again, it's the cases with bigger burns that perished compared to the ones with the small burns. I had a quick look at the 4 cases that died that had small burns, and they were either elderly, or a couple of them were 80 years old, or they had other problems. Like one of the patients had a stroke, and the burn was a secondary problem, and it was a stroke that actually caused the man to die. And this is, so I talk about survival, I talked about, do they get to discharge? And patients do get to discharge, but quality of life doesn't return to normal. This elderly lady was doing her dish, she was in the kitchen, she had her dishwashing gloves on, and the hot water got into the gloves, and elderly people are not as dexterous as younger people, and she couldn't get the gloves off, and so her hands were stuck in the gloves for a long period of time. You can see those fingers needed amputation, and so while she didn't die, she ended up having to be discharged to a nursing home because she couldn't actually do stuff for herself once she was discharged. So it's not only just the cost of, do they survive or do they survive their injury, but what is life like after if they do survive? And, is it sometimes, is it worth, is the pain of the burn injury worth survival? And this looks at hospital length of stay by total body surface area burn group. This is just a box plot where the black lines in the middle of the blue box represent the average length of stay, and the bottom of the blue box is the 25th percentile, and the top is the 75th percentile. So so it just tells you that the bigger the burn, the longer they're going to stay in hospital because they're going to need more surgery, etc. So what is the cost? What does this cost the healthcare system? This paper was published in 2012 in the International Journal of Burns, and it reviewed the costs of burn patients at the Concord Burn Centre in New South Wales, and it looked at data from 2008 to 2010. So the estimates I'm going to show you now are 10 years old, and they don't consider inflation at all. So it showed us that the cost of burn care steadily increased as burn size increases, and then after it reaches 40%, which you can see along the x-axis, that the cost of burn care exponentially increased. And this is likely because we don't have enough skin to take skin grafts and close the wounds, and we need to use bioengineered skin substitutes that cost a truckload of money. But we need to use these products if we want to save life. Because we need to cut off the dead tissue because inflammation is really bad for the body and it can overwhelm the body, and that often causes people to succumb to injury. So they estimated that the average cost per percentage of burn was 6,263 Australian dollars per percent of burn. And in the total of this study, I mentioned before I had 670 cases, and in total they had 5,754 percentages of burns altogether. So I times those all together. It's very basic and mediocre health economics, but the health economists at work said that this does work. That the cost in total for these injuries was over $36 million, or an average of over $4 million annually, but it doesn't include the cost of inflation and CPI, and this is just the in-hospital stay costs. It doesn't consider the loss of income, the impact on the family and the costs that may be incurred from that, or the long-term effects on the quality of life of the person who survives. So, did I just go forward too many? Could you just go back one? Oh, there I go. So in summary, what did I want to say in summary? That the high-risk groups are the extremes of age. The majority of incidences occur in-home while the person's bathing. Current regulations seem to be effective in reducing injury in schools and places where children and aged care residential settings. Mortality is high in the tap skull burn group compared to the other burn population, and this is likely due to the lower physiological reserve to cope with the stress of burn injury at the extremes of age, and there's significant personal and healthcare costs with this. So the Plumbers Code of Australia regulates that to prevent scalding, the delivery temperature of water for personal hygiene should be 45 degrees Celsius for childhood centres, schools and nursing homes, etc., and 50% degrees Celsius for all other buildings. And in the context of the data that I've just shown you, I ask you if we think that this is enough, is this good enough? There's a low incidence in schools and nursing homes, certainly does have a positive influence on legislation, but are we doing enough for those other groups, vulnerable groups who remain in their homes? Or what else can we do to help protect our most vulnerable? And certainly from our narrow perspective, the burn services and the Australian New Zealand Burns Association, we're going, yeah, we need to change legislation so that tempering valves and thermostatic valves should be installed in all residential settings. And certainly laws such as mandatory bike helmets, smoke alarms show a really good track record of how potential success these types of regulations can, save life in the future. However, we don't know whether this is actually feasible and whether can you install tempering valves and thermostatic valves in all houses? Is it feasible? And what are the implications of this? And so, maybe our narrow vision isn't the wizard. We're not going to get to the land of Oz, and we need to temper our vision somewhat, or stage it, or do it in stages. So I came here today to tell you what the burns community knows about tap water scalds, and we'd like to learn more about what you know so we can better understand all perspectives of this problem. And I just wanted to talk about this parable of a group of blind men who came across an elephant for the first time, and each blind man felt a different part of the elephant, which they described to each other, and by doing this, they were able to build a comprehensive view of what the entire animal looked like, because they each had their own individual view. So tap water skull burn injury is the elephant that we share, and we'd certainly like to work with you and other stakeholders to better understand the problem, to see if there's more that we can do. We are slowly and systematically reaching out to other stakeholder groups across our country. I'm meeting with the Victorian Department of Health next week, and we'd like to open up dialogue to see if there is more that we can do to prevent this problem, particularly as we are projecting a silver tsunami coming up in around, I think, the 2030s. And just to conclude, this problem is not just in Australia and New Zealand. I took this picture of the World Plumbing Congress, and this is where all the delegates come from across the world. And there are burn registries and burn care organisations across the world, and if there are delegates here who'd like to get in contact with these other countries, let me know. I've got my contact details coming up. All these registries collect data on tap water skulls. The Global Burn Registry of the World Health Organisation is a little bit more complex, but the British Burns and the American Burns Association have good data like we have. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say, when we're alone, we can do so little, and together we can do so much, and we can help people like Nolene and Bob. Thank you.